Well, let's unpack the Finance Minister's tight midterm budget speech, and we're joined by the Budget Justice Coalition chairperson, Matshidiso Lencoasa. She's in studio with me, and on the virtual platform, it's PricewaterhouseCoopers senior economist, Christie Viljoen. To both my guests, good evening to you, and thank you very much for your time. Matshidiso, let's start with you. Your key takeouts from this budget.
So first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity. So the key takeouts, first impressions of this budget is that, it's a new administration, but it's the same old austerity. So you could have tabled, the minister could have tabled this budget last year and it would have been the exact same. There are no new innovative measures to, we were expecting some form of interventions to redress our triple challenge of poverty, inequality and unemployment. And government has been complaining for many years that we are in a tight fiscal position, and so they've been enacting budget cuts towards basic education, healthcare and social development programs. And so we thought that with, this GNU, that maybe there might be an opportunity for a human rights-based budget, because many of the parties made campaign promises leading up to, getting into power, leading up to the GNU. But unfortunately, it just seems that the budgets, there are no resources to allocated to support these campaign promises that these parties had made to their voters.
Christie, let me come to you. We have a government of national unity that is set to be business friendly. You also have had, for the last few months, load shedding is almost a thing of the past now. So why are we here? What's your sentiment?
Well, I have to agree to a certain extent that this budget was a bit uninspiring. Now, generally, we don't want budgets to be shocking or volatile or fireworks. But correct, we've got a different kind of government now, which has many different voices, many different ideas, where we should have been able to pull some of those ideas in. This budget is very much similar to what we had in Feb and last year, October. So there's maybe a hope that in the main budget next year, we get some creative ideas. But to be honest, we're not in a different place today than we were yesterday. The minister has recalculated his numbers in terms of economic growth, tax revenue, the deficit, debt, etc. But the question I always ask myself, is South Africa in a different place now compared to before the speech? And honestly, no, it's very much business as usual for the budget speech, to be honest.
Yeah, but let's try and perhaps understand why we have an uninspiring budget. The debt to GDP, Matshidiso, now stands at 74%. The growth forecast has been revised down from 1.3 to 1.1. Government is trying to encourage its own employees to say, take early retirement. And here is an amount of 11 billion to try and make this a little bit lucrative for them, in order to get rid, I think, of some 30,000 people, I think, that are close to retirement, if my figures are correct. Shouldn't we understand it from that point of view?
Sure. So when it comes to this budget, I think it is true that we should be looking at it at that point of view, but we should also understand the context in which we find our country right now. And so we've been enduring weak economic climate for many, many years, and government in response to this had committed to fiscal consolidation, which was a form of budgeting that tried to reduce public spending, reduce the public sector wage bill, and also introduce some regressive tax measures, hoping that it would reduce the budget deficits and maybe inspire businesses to invest, and maybe it would create jobs. But so far, we're not seeing any of that. In fact, the revenue forecasts are lower than we expected. The GDP, the growth is lower than expected. And this is concerning for us as civil society, because it means that there aren't the resources, sufficient resources that are mobilized to fund basic education, to fund healthcare, to fund social development. And so when we look at a budget like this, we start to think, what next? What can we do as a country? Because our fiscal policy isn't really inspiring any hope for us, or doesn't reflect a government that's really committed to redressing these problems of poverty and inequality among that. And also, of course, the 11 billion, that incentive, to get that early retirement, that we thought, maybe there might be more innovative ways to actually address the issue, which is that, healthcare and education sectors are deeply understaffed. And so you want to reduce the public sector wage bill, but there's a growing number of, a growing need and growing demand for those services. And so, there are things that the government is committed to doing. And in this budget, it doesn't reflect the realities of the people on the ground that are having to use these services.
Christie, it's perhaps a case of social spending versus investment spending. Hasn't government really tried to strike a balance here? Because you still have the SRD, that social relief of distress grant. It's now grown to 370 Rand from 350. You still have, yes, marginal increases to the usual social grant that has always been there. Has government really not tried to strike that balance?
Well, the tricky thing is that it is striking that balance on a daily basis. But it's a bit like a seesaw, depending on what's the most important to someone that looks at this budget or debates this budget or gets interviewed about this budget. For some people, it is more important than social spending for very good reasons. For other people, infrastructure is very important, again, for very big reasons. I think what often happens is that we look at the fiscal budget as sort of like the document that needs to save the economy. Yes, the finance minister holds the purse and the way that the money gets spent, that's true. But getting this economy growing and creating more jobs, for example, that's not really the finance minister's responsibility. If we think, for example, of just the high failure rate of small businesses, of entrepreneurs, of startups, if we can get those numbers reduced, if many more small businesses survive and create more jobs, we can address those triple challenges. It's not really with the finance minister to fix that. That's with the Department of Small Business, for example. So I think we often try and get too much from the finance minister. And he obviously does his best within his party, within his government, I'm sure within his own department. There are many different forces pulling from one side to the next. And in a perfect world where debt isn't high and we don't have a big budget deficit, these things would be much easier. But the fact is that our budget is constrained and the finance minister can only do so much with the money that he has.
Matshidiso, we're winding this down now. Let's talk about perhaps some of the things that you feel were or could perhaps not have been allocated monies. I have looked at what is called a taxi relief fund. An amount of 300 million Rand will be paid to the taxi relief fund, which was set up during the pandemic. And this is meant to essentially say to taxi owners, here you are for the difficulties of the COVID period. This is money that's being given to people who are terrorizing motorists in Mpumalanga for giving hitchhikers a lift. For me, I'm talking as a citizen now, I have a problem with that. Where, for you, are some of the areas where the minister could have said, not you?
No, that's very interesting perspective. And so this is obviously the first impressions in terms of the budget, and we will continue to look at it line by line. But so far what we have seen is, of course, we would have preferred a more human rights-based budget, and we would have preferred specifically more funding or relief towards social spending and away from, say, for instance, maybe reutilizing instruments like the health policy levy, for example, or sin taxes, for example, because our view is that in this harsh economic climate, there's a certain group of people who are disproportionately carrying the burden, being the everyday users of the education and healthcare systems. And so, if we're really in a tough economic environment, it's not good enough to just say, we're going to cut this budget. We should be looking at, who's bearing the burden? And our view is that, corporates, particularly, and not just everyday businesses, of course, we're in support of everyday businesses because they drive employment or should be driving employment. Yeah. But we're looking at mega corporations and the ultra wealthy who do not pay taxes. And, or, you know, we're also looking at debt reform, for instance, like our debt servicing costs are rising. And so we're looking at the G20, for instance, which was mentioned in the speech, as an opportunity to really put on the table reforms towards tax and debt. And that will maybe go a long way in unlocking funds to advance education and healthcare. So that's how we're seeing it in terms of first impressions. But yeah, those, I think that the 11 billion, for instance, I think Treasury might not have to think that one through, because I'm not really sure if that's going to actually increase the headcount in understaffed hospitals, understaffed clinics and education systems. And so I think those are some of the areas that initially we're quite concerned about, regarding this budget.
Christie, final question for you, and perhaps it's a question in twofold. So first of all, if debt to GDP currently stands at 74%, how close are we to the so-called fiscal cliff? But also importantly, I am all for money being put towards our security forces. So I'm quite happy with the DRC receiving, or should I say the military, receiving an amount of about 3.5 billion, given the deployment of the South African National Defence Force in peacekeeping missions. We have a colleague in the DRC, and he's bringing us some really heart-wrenching stories about the suffering of the people of the DRC because of the fighting there. And then you look at the home front, you have people that are being massacred week in, week out. The police, I wouldn't have minded if they had received such an amount as well. So you tell us where you think this was money put to good causes versus those that perhaps has gone to waste.
We often talk about a fiscal cliff, and it's one of those where maybe if we imagine ourselves standing close to a cliff, we see it over there, we're not going to walk close enough to actually fall off. And that's what the finance minister has been doing for the past 5, 10, 15 years, making sure that we don't reach that fiscal cliff. Now, limiting where debt goes is part of the story. Being creative at how we spend money, that's also part of the story. You mentioned the Defence Force, which I think has probably bared the brunt over the past 10 years of seeing big cuts in spending because there's prioritization of social aspects like housing, education, healthcare, etc. So I'm never concerned that we're going to get to that point where we've got a fiscal cliff where we fall over and we have to shut down all our hospitals, for example. That would not happen. We will always have someone that is willing and able to jump in, whether it's private business, civil society. We as a country have solutions that will keep us from actually getting to that point where it's like a point of no return.
Christie Viljoen, he is a senior economist at PricewaterhouseCoopers. Thank you very much for your contribution to this discussion. Matshidiso Lencoasa, she is from the Budget Justice Coalition, a chairperson. Thank you indeed for joining us in studio tonight.